July 14th, 1944. The rolling fields of Normandy shimmered under a relentless summer sun, as Sergeant Joseph Darnell crouched beside his modified Sherman tank, sweat trickling down his temple. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions. German Panthers were cutting through the American line just 2 kilometers east. 3 Shermans had already been hit, their crews lost in thunderous explosions that echoed across the battlefield. Through binoculars, Darnell could see the distinctive silhouette of a Panther emerging from the tree line, its long 75mm gun scanning for targets. "Hold position and wait for the heavies," came the order from battalion command. "Do not engage the Panthers! Repeat, do not engage!" Darnell's hand tightened around his binoculars. Beside him, his gunner, Private First Class Thomas Welch, exchanged a knowing look with him. They both knew what the order meant. More dead Americans while they waited for tank destroyers that might never arrive in time. "Sir," Welch whispered, nodding toward the tank. "We can hit them. The modifications." Darnell glanced at his Sherman, not the standard model with the inadequate 75mm gun that the entire battalion had been equipped with, but something different, something unauthorized. In the dead of night 2 weeks earlier, he had overseen an improvised upgrade that the engineers swore would never work, and his commanding officer had explicitly forbidden. He made his decision in a heartbeat. "Mount up," he ordered his crew, climbing into the tank as distant explosions illuminated the horizon. "We're moving out." "But sir," his driver, Corporal Mason, protested, "orders are to hold position." "And we'll all die waiting," Darnell replied, settling into his commander's position. "Sometimes you have to disobey to survive." As the Sherman's engine roared to life, none of the men in the 4th Armored Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history and forever change the way American tankers fought the dreaded Panthers that had dominated the European battlefield for far too long. Joseph Darnell was born on April 3rd, 1922, in the small farming community of Coopersville, Michigan. The son of a World War I veteran and mechanic, young Joseph spent his childhood with hands perpetually stained with engine grease, learning to fix everything from tractors to Model T Fords in his father's workshop. While other boys played baseball, Joseph disassembled carburetors and rebuilt transmissions, developing an instinctive understanding of machinery that would one day save dozens of American lives. His father, Michael Darnell, had served in the American Expeditionary Forces during the Great War, returning with both a Purple Heart from a German artillery shell and a deep appreciation for innovation under pressure. "The men who survived weren't always the strongest," he would tell his son. "They were the ones who could think when everyone else was frozen with fear." These lessons took root in young Joseph's mind, alongside a natural talent for mechanical improvisation that earned him a reputation throughout the county. By his 17th birthday, farmers from 3 counties away would bring their broken equipment to the Darnell workshop when all other mechanics had given up. When Joseph graduated from Coopersville High School in 1940, he had already decided to follow his father's footsteps into military service. Pearl Harbor only hastened the inevitable. He enlisted on December 9th, 1941, just 2 days after the attack that brought America into the global conflict. His mechanical aptitude immediately caught the attention of his training officers at Fort Knox, Kentucky. While most recruits struggled with basic vehicle maintenance, Darnell was already suggesting improvements to the training tanks. His instructors recognized his talent, but often cautioned him about his tendency to improvise rather than follow established procedures. "You can't just modify military equipment on a whim, Darnell," his drill sergeant warned after catching him adjusting the transmission on a training vehicle. "In combat, predictability saves lives. Every tank, every gun, every procedure needs to be standardized, so replacements know exactly what they're dealing with." Darnell nodded respectfully, but couldn't help thinking that his sergeant had never faced German panzer divisions with superior firepower. He hadn't yet learned that sometimes survival required breaking the rules. After completing basic training, Darnell was assigned to the 4th Armored Division, where he quickly established himself as both an exceptional tanker and something of a troublemaker. His crew respected his mechanical genius and battlefield instincts, but his commanding officers viewed his constant questioning of equipment and tactics with suspicion. "Darnell thinks he knows better than the entire Ordnance Department," one officer remarked in his evaluation. Him shows exceptional promise if he can learn to follow orders instead of improvising. By early 1944, as the Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, Darnell had risen to the rank of sergeant despite his reputation. He was assigned as tank commander of a standard M4 Sherman tank, dubbed Detroit Iron by its crew. Though he never said it aloud, Darnell harbored serious concerns about the Sherman's capabilities against German armor, concerns that would soon be validated in the blood-soaked fields of France. "These tanks are coffins," he confided to his closest friend and gunner, Thomas Welch, as they prepared for deployment. "The Germans have been improving their Panthers and Tigers for years, while we're still rolling out the same basic design with a pea shooter for a gun." Welch nodded grimly. "Command says our advantage is in numbers, more Shermans than they have Panthers. Cold comfort for the crews who burn," Darnell replied softly, "but maybe there's a way to even the odds." He had no idea that soon. Those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. For dozens of American tankers facing the deadly German Panthers in the hedgerows of Normandy. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy was well underway. Operation Overlord had successfully established a foothold in Nazi-occupied France, but the advance inland had bogged down in the notorious Bocage country, a landscape of ancient hedgerows that created natural defensive barriers perfect for German ambushes. The 4th Armored Division had landed on Utah Beach on July 11, 1944, and was immediately thrown into the brutal hedgerow fighting as part of Operation Cobra, the American breakout attempt from the Normandy beachhead. The division's objective was to punch through German lines near St. Lo and exploit any breakthrough with a rapid advance towards strategic crossroads. What the American commanders hadn't fully appreciated was the devastating effectiveness of German armor in this terrain. The Panther tank, with its powerful 75mm KWK-42 gun, sloped armor, and excellent optics, had been specifically designed to counter Soviet T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front. Against the standard American M4 Sherman, the Panther possessed overwhelming advantages. The statistics told a grim story. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, making it effectively 134mm thick against incoming rounds. By comparison, the Sherman's frontal armor was just 63mm with minimal sloping. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from 1,500 meters away. While the Sherman's standard 75mm M3 gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's armor even at point-blank range. In tactical terms, this meant that German Panthers could destroy American Shermans long before the Shermans could get close enough to be effective. The mathematical reality was brutal. It took 5 Shermans to destroy one Panther, and even then, only by maneuvering to hit its more vulnerable sides and rear. A nearly impossible task in the confined Norman hedgerows. The American response to this disparity was primarily logistical. While they acknowledged the Sherman's inferiority in tank versus tank combat, U.S. Army doctrine emphasized mass production and numerical superiority. America could produce 50,000 Shermans during the war, while Germany managed to build just under 6,000 Panthers. The cold calculus of industrialized warfare accepted the higher American casualty rates as the cost of eventual victory. For the tankers themselves, this doctrine translated into a terrifying reality. Sherman crews called their tanks Ronson Lighters, after a popular cigarette lighter brand whose slogan promised it, "Lights first, every time." The Sherman's gasoline engine and ammunition storage made it prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated by enemy shells, earning it another grim nickname, the brewing coffin. The standard tactical directive for Sherman crews facing Panthers was to avoid direct engagement. They were to hold position and call for tank destroyers, like the M10 Wolverine, or air support to deal with German heavy armor. Alternatively, they were to attempt to outflank the Panthers and attack from the sides or rear, tactics that were often suicidal in the confines of the Norman countryside. By mid-July 1944, the 4th Armored Division had already lost 17 Shermans to Panthers without destroying a single German tank. Morale among tank crews was plummeting as they faced what seemed like a mechanical mismatch that no amount of courage could overcome. This was the context in which Sergeant Joseph Darnell found himself questioning orders and contemplating the unthinkable: an unauthorized modification of U.S. Army equipment in a desperate bid to give his crew and fellow tankers a fighting chance against the Panthers that hunted them. "We need a bigger gun," Darnell had insisted during a briefing 3 weeks earlier, after watching 2 Shermans from his company go up in flames. "Our 75mm bounces off Panthers like pebbles." "That's why we have tank destroyers, Sergeant," Captain Howard Riley had replied tersely. "Stick to the doctrine and wait for the TDs when you encounter Panthers." Darnell had bitten his tongue, but later that night, he'd sought out Master Sergeant Frank Irwin at the division's mobile ordnance workshop. What began as a theoretical discussion about the Sherman's limitations soon evolved into something far more daring and explicitly against regulations. It was a plan born of desperation, mechanical ingenuity, and the growing certainty that following standard procedures meant death in the Norman hedgerows. As July 14th dawned, that plan was about to be put to the ultimate test against the steel monsters that had made the battlefield a graveyard for American tankers. The engine of Detroit iron roared as Darnell's Sherman burst from its concealed position, sending mud flying from its tracks. In the commander's cupola, Darnell scanned the terrain ahead, his heart pounding against his ribs. The rest of the company remained in their defensive positions, radio operators frantically calling for him to return. "Darnell, this is Captain Riley. Return to position immediately. That is a direct order." Darnell ignored the transmission. Through his binoculars, he could see a column of 3 Panthers advancing toward the American position, unaware of the lone Sherman now moving to intercept them from an unexpected angle. The lead German tank was already within range of the American lines, its long gun traversing as it searched for targets. "Mason, keep us in defilade behind that ridgeline," Darnell ordered his driver. "Welch, get ready. We'll have 1 shot before they know we're here." "Yes, sir," Welch replied from the gunner's position, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped them all. At 23, Thomas Welch had been a factory worker from Pennsylvania before the war, with a natural talent for spatial geometry that made him an exceptional gunner. He understood trajectories and angles instinctively, a gift that had saved their lives more than once. "Loading armor-piercing," announced Corporal Ray Hawkins, the loader, as he hefted the shell into the breech of their modified gun. At 19, Hawkins was the youngest of the crew, a former high school football player whose powerful build made him perfect for the physically demanding role of loader. In the driver's seat, Corporal James Mason navigated the Sherman with the precision of the New York cab driver he'd been in civilian life. At 27, he was the oldest of the crew and often served as the voice of caution to balance Darnell's more aggressive instincts. "Radio's going crazy, Sarge," reported Private Eddie Lombardi, their assistant driver and radio operator. The son of Italian immigrants from Boston, Lombardi had a gift for languages that had proved useful more than once when interrogating German prisoners. "Captain's threatening court-martial if we don't return to position." "Tell him we're experiencing radio difficulties," Darnell replied, not taking his eyes off the advancing Panthers. The odds were stark. 3 Panthers against 1 Sherman. Even with their modifications, they were outgunned and outarmored. The standard doctrine, drilled into every American tanker, was clear. Shermans did not engage Panthers head-on. It was suicide. But Darnell knew something the German commanders didn't. 2 weeks earlier, after losing 3 tanks from their company to Panther ambushes, he had worked through 4 consecutive nights with Master Sergeant Irwin to modify Detroit iron in ways that Technical Services Command would never have authorized. The most significant change was the gun. They had replaced the standard 75mm M3 with a new 76mm M1 gun that had recently arrived in the European theater, but had not yet been widely deployed. The 76mm offered greater muzzle velocity and penetrating power, potentially capable of defeating a Panther's armor at reasonable ranges. The modification required significant changes to the turret and breech mechanism, improvised with salvaged parts and working entirely from Darnell's mechanical intuition rather than official specifications. "We're committing at least 3 violations of equipment modification protocols," Irwin had warned, as they worked. If this doesn't work, we'll both be busting rocks at Leavenworth, if we survive. And if it does work, Darnell had asked, then maybe they'll name a medal after you instead, Irwin had replied with a grim smile. Now, as Detroit Iron maneuvered into firing position, those unauthorized modifications were about to face their trial by fire. The lead Panther was 800 meters away, its commander apparently focused on the main American position and unaware of the flanking Sherman. Range 780 meters, Darnell called out. Panther at our 2 o'clock. Welch, can you make the shot? Yes, sir, Welch replied, adjusting his sight, aiming for lower hull junction, right side. This was another of Darnell's innovations. Through careful study of recovered Panther wrecks, he had identified a relative weak point where the lower hull side plates joined the frontal armor. It wasn't a guaranteed kill, but it offered better odds than the standard target points taught in training. On my mark, Darnell said, watching as the Panther began to turn its turret, perhaps sensing their presence. 3, 2, 1. Fire! The Sherman rocked backward as the 76mm gun roared, the shells streaking across the field toward the Panther. For a breathless moment, time seemed to stop as 5 American tankers watched the tracer disappear against the dark silhouette of the German tank. Then came the explosion, not the dull clang of a deflected round, but the sharp crack of penetration followed by a secondary explosion as ammunition inside the Panther detonated. Flames erupted from the German tank's hatches, followed by billowing black smoke. Hit! Penetration! Welch shouted, disbelief in his voice. We got him! There was no time to celebrate. The other 2 Panthers were already reacting, their turrets swinging toward the unexpected threat. Back up now, Darnell ordered. Get us behind the ridge. Mason threw the Sherman into reverse as a German shell screamed overhead, missing them by meters. They backed behind the sheltering ridgeline just as 2 more shells impacted where they had been moments before. And circle around to position Delta, Darnell ordered, referring to an alternate firing position they had identified earlier. We'll hit the next one from a different angle. As Detroit Iron maneuvered through the cover of a shallow draw, Darnell's mind raced. They had actually done it, penetrated and destroyed a Panther with a Sherman, something every training manual said was virtually impossible from the front. The modified 76mm gun, with its specially prepared ammunition, had performed even better than he had hoped. But 2 more Panthers remained, and now they were alert and hunting. The element of surprise was gone. The next engagement would be even more dangerous. Sir, Lombardi called up from the radio. Captain Riley is going ballistic. Says we're to return immediately or face charges. Tell him we've destroyed 1 Panther and are engaging the others, Darnell replied. Ask for support from Baker Company to hit them from the south while we keep their attention. As they reached their new position, Darnell could see that the German tankers had adopted a defensive posture, 1 Panther covering the other as they scanned for the Sherman that had destroyed their lead tank. They were professionals, veterans of the Eastern Front by the look of their tactical response, not easily rattled by the loss of 1 tank. Range 920 meters, Darnell called. Welch, same shot if you can get it. Sir, that's at the absolute edge of our effective range, Welch warned. I know, Darnell replied, but they don't know that. They think we're still using the standard 75mm that couldn't penetrate them at half this distance. This psychological edge was perhaps as important as the technical modifications. German Panther commanders had grown accustomed to near invulnerability against Shermans at range. They operated with a confidence born of technological superiority, often exposing their tanks in ways they never would against an equal opponent. Steady! Steady! Darnell watched through his binoculars as one of the Panthers began to move, presenting its side profile as it attempted to flank what it believed was a standard Sherman that posed no threat beyond close range. Target acquired, Welch reported. Side armor, mid-hull. Fire when ready! The gun thundered again, the shell arcing across the battlefield. This time the Germans were partially prepared, the Panther attempting to turn to present its stronger frontal armor. But the maneuver came too late. The 76mm shell struck the tank's side, penetrating the thinner armor and detonating inside. The Panther didn't explode spectacularly like the first, but thick smoke began pouring from its engine compartment, and its turret stopped moving. Mobility kill at minimum, Hawkins observed as he loaded another shell. They're not going anywhere. The third Panther, now alone and facing an opponent that had inexplicably destroyed two of its companions, began a tactical withdrawal, using smoke grenades to cover its retreat. "Should we pursue, sir?" Mason asked from the driver's seat. Darnell considered for a moment. "No, we've broken their advance. Let's rejoin the company before Captain Riley has us all shot." As they turned back toward the American lines, Darnell felt a complex mix of emotions: elation at their success, vindication of his modifications, but also apprehension about the consequences of his insubordination. He had directly disobeyed orders, modified U.S. Army equipment without authorization, and led his crew into an engagement that doctrine expressly forbade. The radio crackled with Captain Riley's voice, now strangely subdued. "Darnell, return to CP immediately, and good work." Darnell exchanged surprised glances with Lombardi. Perhaps the court-martial would wait. After all, they had just accomplished what no Sherman crew was supposed to be able to do. They had taken on Panthers head-to-head and won. What none of them realized yet was that those few minutes of combat would eventually change the entire approach to American tank warfare in Europe. The mathematical certainty of Panther superiority had just been shattered by one sergeant's unauthorized innovation and the courage to defy orders when those orders meant certain death. Word of Detroit Irons' impossible feat spread through the 4th Armored Division with the speed of combat radio. By nightfall, Darnell and his crew had been summoned not to a court-martial proceeding, but to division headquarters, where Colonel Wendell Peterson, the division commander, waited with an array of staff officers and one unexpected visitor, a brigadier general from Patton's 3rd Army Staff. "Sergeant Darnell," Colonel Peterson began formally, "you directly violated orders, engaged enemy armor against explicit instructions to hold position, and, most seriously, made unauthorized modifications to United States Army equipment." Darnell stood at rigid attention, his crew lined up beside him. This was it, he thought, the end of his military career. "However," Peterson continued, his stern expression softening slightly, "you also destroyed 2 Panther tanks that were threatening to break through our lines, potentially saving dozens of American lives." The brigadier general stepped forward, studying Darnell with intense interest. "Tell me exactly what modifications you made to your Sherman, Sergeant. Don't leave out any details." For the next hour, Darnell explained the technical specifics of their improvised upgrade. How they had mounted the new 76mm gun that had arrived with the latest shipment of equipment but hadn't yet been officially deployed. How they had reinforced the turret ring to handle the increased recoil. How they had recalibrated the fire control system for the new ballistics, and how they had identified the specific vulnerability in the Panther's armor. "And who authorized these modifications?" the general asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No one, sir," Darnell replied honestly. "I take full responsibility. My crew was following my orders." The general exchanged glances with Colonel Peterson. "Your insubordination cannot be overlooked, Sergeant. However, your results cannot be ignored either." What followed was unprecedented. Instead of punishment, Darnell was temporarily attached to the division's ordnance company to supervise the modification of 20 more Shermans with the 76 Mithra gun. The Darnell conversion, as it came to be informally known, was implemented under the official pretense of field testing the new weapon system. Over the next 72 hours, Darnell worked without sleep, personally overseeing each conversion and training gunners in the new targeting techniques he had developed. The mechanics and engineers who had initially resisted his unorthodox methods now watched in amazement as he solved problems that had stymied their conventional approaches. "You're either a genius or insane," remarked Captain Lewis from Ordnance, after watching Darnell improvise a solution to a turret balancing issue that had been deemed unsolvable without factory recalibration. "Probably both," and Darnell replied, without looking up from his work. "Hand me that torque wrench." On July 18th, 1944, just 4 days after Darnell's initial engagement, the modified Shermans were deployed in combat for the first time as a unit. The opportunity came during a German counterattack near Perrier, where intelligence had identified elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division attempting to disrupt the American advance. 8 Panthers, supported by infantry, had launched a dawn assault on positions held by the 4th Armored. Instead of the expected easy hunting, they found themselves facing Shermans that could penetrate their armor at ranges previously considered safe. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes. 6 Panthers were destroyed, with the remaining 2 retreating in confusion. American losses were limited to 1 Sherman damaged by artillery rather than tank fire. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. For American tankers, the revelation that they could stand and fight rather than retreat from Panthers transformed morale overnight. For the German commanders, the sudden appearance of Shermans that could defeat their Panthers at range was a shocking development that forced an immediate reassessment of tactics. A captured German officer, when interrogated about the battle, expressed the disbelief that rippled through the panzer units. "It is impossible. The Sherman cannot penetrate Panther armor except at suicidal ranges. Yet we saw them hitting effectively from 800 meters. Something has changed." Something had indeed changed, and it had started with one sergeant's willingness to disobey orders and trust his own mechanical instincts over established doctrine. The Darnell conversion would soon be officially recognized, retroactively authorized, and expanded across multiple armored divisions as the M4A1 76W Sherman. The W designating the wet stowage system for ammunition that reduced the risk of catastrophic fires that had plagued earlier models. By August 1944, as Operation Cobra broke the German lines and American armor began the rapid advance across France, Joseph Darnell had been promoted to 2nd lieutenant, an uncommon field promotion that acknowledged his contribution without drawing unwanted attention to the initially unauthorized nature of his innovations. His commanding officers carefully documented his actions as exceptional initiative in combat conditions, rather than deliberate violation of equipment modification protocols. In the official report submitted to 3rd Army Headquarters, described the gun upgrade as a field expedient implementation of planned improvements, rather than an unauthorized modification. This careful reframing allowed the Army to adopt Darnell's innovations without acknowledging that a sergeant had effectively overridden years of armored doctrine through an act of technical disobedience. It was a pragmatic compromise between military discipline and battlefield necessity. For Darnell and his original crew, however, the truth was simpler. They had faced a choice between following orders and surviving, and they had chosen survival through innovation. As Welch put it, during a rare moment of reflection weeks later, sometimes the rulebook is wrong, and when it is, you have to choose between being disciplined and being alive. As the Allied armies pushed toward Germany in the autumn of 1944, the impact of the 76mm Sherman spread far beyond the 4th Armored Division. Ordnance officers from other units sought out the Panther killers to learn their techniques, and Darnell found himself repeatedly pulled from combat to advise on tank modifications and tactics. The ripple effects extended all the way to the factories in the United States, where production priorities shifted to accelerate the manufacture of 76mm equipped Shermans. By December 1944, when the Germans launched the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, the new Shermans had become numerous enough to make a significant difference in blunting the German armored thrust. In a twist of historical irony, one of the key factors that prevented a complete breakthrough by German forces during the initial stages of the offensive was the unexpected resistance from 76mm equipped Shermans that German planners had not accounted for in their operational calculations. Panthers that expected to encounter only the vulnerable 75mm Shermans instead found themselves facing tanks that could penetrate their armor at combat ranges. For Joseph Darnell, the Battle of the Bulge brought both validation and a harsh reminder of war's cost. Assigned to Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, he led a platoon of modified Shermans in the desperate relief of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by German forces. In the bitter cold of December 1944, Darnell's platoon destroyed 7 German armored vehicles, including 3 Panthers, while losing only 1 Sherman to a mine rather than enemy fire. His actions during the relief operation earned him the Silver Star, presented personally by General George Patton, who had taken particular interest in the success of the upgunned Shermans. Yet the triumph came with tragedy. During an engagement near Chaumont, Thomas Welch, Darnell's original gunner and friend who had supported his modifications from the beginning, was killed when their tank was hit by a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket fired by German infantry. Though the 76mm gun had made the Sherman more effective against German tanks, it offered no additional protection against infantry anti-tank weapons. Darnell was wounded in the same attack, taking shrapnel in his left arm and leg. As he was evacuated to a field hospital, he carried with him Welch's dog tags and a blood-stained letter to Welch's fiancée back in Pennsylvania, a letter Darnell would personally deliver after the war. By January 1945, the significance of the 76mm Sherman had been officially recognized at the highest levels of Allied command. General Omar Bradley's after-action report on the Battle of the Bulge specifically cited the improved Sherman's performance against German armor as a key factor in containing the offensive. The report carefully avoided mentioning that the initial modification had been unauthorized, instead presenting it as part of the planned evolution of American armor. History was being subtly rewritten to preserve the narrative of orderly military development, rather than acknowledging that a crucial innovation had come from a sergeant acting against orders. For Joseph Darnell, recuperating in a military hospital in England, the politics of credit were irrelevant compared to the lives saved. He had received dozens of letters from Sherman crews who believed they had survived because of the upgraded gun. One lieutenant from the 2nd Armored Division wrote, "My crew and I owe our lives to whoever put that 76mm in our tank. We took on 2 Panthers outside Houffalize and lived to tell about it. A month earlier, we'd have been burning before we could even aim." By the time Darnell returned to combat in March 1945, the 76mm Sherman had become the standard rather than the exception. The final offensive into Germany saw American armored divisions operating with a confidence that would have been unthinkable during the hedgerow fighting of Normandy. On April 12, 1945, in one of the war's final armored engagements, Darnell's platoon encountered a mixed force of Panthers and the newer, even more formidable Tiger II heavy tanks near Bayreuth, Germany. In the ensuing battle, the 76mm Shermans demonstrated that while they still couldn't match the German tanks in armor or gunpowder, they had closed the gap enough to fight effectively through superior tactics and teamwork. Darnell's after-action report noted, "Our gunners now engage with confidence rather than fear. The psychological advantage of knowing they can penetrate enemy armor has transformed their effectiveness. We no longer avoid German heavy tanks, we hunt them." As the European war ground toward its conclusion in May 1945, Joseph Darnell found himself summoned to Supreme Allied Headquarters. There, to his astonishment, he was introduced to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had requested a briefing on the Sherman Improvement Initiative from one of its key implementers. "Lieutenant Darnell," Eisenhower said after hearing his explanation of the modifications, "your story represents something uniquely American, the ability to innovate under pressure and adapt to battlefield realities." He paused, studying Darnell thoughtfully. "Though I understand the initial modifications were not precisely by the book." "No, sir," Darnell admitted. "They weren't." Eisenhower nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "There's often a tension between procedure and pragmatism in war. The best commanders know when to follow the rules and when the rules need to change." He extended his hand. "Your initiative likely saved hundreds of American lives. Remember that, long after the war is over." When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Joseph Darnell was among the millions of American servicemen preparing for potential deployment to the Pacific. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August made that deployment unnecessary, and by October, he was on a transport ship bound for home. He returned to Coopersville, Michigan, with a collection of medals, permanent partial disability in his left arm from his wounds, and a deep reservoir of experiences that few in his hometown could comprehend. Like many veterans, he spoke little of the war, preferring to focus on building a civilian life. Using his mechanical skills and the GI Bill, Darnell opened an automotive repair shop that quickly prospered in the post-war economic boom. He married Marie Collins, a local schoolteacher, in 1946, and they raised 3 children in a modest home not far from where he had grown up. To most of his customers and neighbors, Joseph Darnell was simply a skilled mechanic with a quiet demeanor. Few knew that he had fundamentally changed the course of armored warfare through an act of mechanical disobedience. Occasionally, former tankers would seek out his shop, having heard through veterans' networks about the guy who fixed the Sherman. They would arrive unannounced, often traveling hundreds of miles, just to shake his hand and share a quiet moment of understanding. One such visitor, in 1957, was James Irwin, now a professor of mechanical engineering at Purdue University, who had been developing the original 76mm Sherman modification with Darnell. Their reunion in Darnell's small office behind the repair shop was emotional, but understated. 2 men who had shared an experience that had shaped history in ways few civilians could comprehend. "They're teaching it at Fort Knox now," Irwin told him. "The Darnell Engagement, they call it. A case study in battlefield innovation and tactical adaptation." Darnell shook his head in bemusement. "And do they mention that it was completely unauthorized and could have gotten us court-martialed?" "They've sanitized that part," Irwin admitted with a smile. "Now it's an example of field-expedient implementation of technical improvements, all very official and approved." "History written by the survivors," Darnell observed, pouring them each a cup of coffee. "And rewritten by the bureaucrats," Irwin added, "but we know the truth." In 1963, nearly 2 decades after his act of mechanical disobedience, Darnell received an unexpected letter from the Department of the Army. The letter invited him to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to speak at a symposium on armored warfare innovation, a formal recognition of his contribution that had been long delayed by the uncomfortable fact that his innovation had begun as an unauthorized modification. The letter included a personal note from the commander of the armor school. "Time has given us the perspective to acknowledge that sometimes progress requires challenging, established doctrine. Your actions in 1944 represent the best tradition of American pragmatic innovation under fire." Darnell accepted the invitation with characteristic modesty. Standing before an audience of officers and cadets, many of whom weren't born when he had modified his first Sherman, he spoke not of his own ingenuity, but of the courage of his original crew. "Technical innovation means nothing without the men willing to risk their lives to implement it," he told the hushed auditorium. "Thomas Welch, my gunner, believed in the modification enough to put his life behind it. He didn't survive to see how many lives his courage ultimately saved." The speech was recorded for the Armor School's training archives, where it became required viewing for officer candidates studying tactical innovation. More importantly, it sparked a systematic review of how the Army approached battlefield modifications and technical feedback from frontline units. By the late 1960s, as American forces became increasingly engaged in Vietnam, the lessons of Darnell's Sherman modifications had evolved into a more formalized process for field adaptations of equipment. The Army established tactical development teams, specifically tasked with evaluating combat unit innovations and fast-tracking promising modifications. In 1972, as Joseph Darnell approached his 50th birthday, he received another unexpected communication, this time from the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Researchers analyzing preserved Panther tanks from World War II had confirmed something remarkable about his original targeting technique. The weak point he had identified at the junction of the lower hull side and frontal armor plate was indeed a manufacturing vulnerability, one that German engineers had documented in their own internal reports, but had never fully resolved due to production pressures. Darnell's mechanical intuition, developed in his father's rural workshop, had independently discovered what German industrial engineers had known but failed to correct. This revelation led to Darnell's story being included in the curriculum at West Point and other military academies as an example of how practical experience and mechanical intuition could sometimes identify vulnerabilities that formal engineering processes missed. For the men who had served in Sherman tanks, however, Darnell's contribution didn't need academic validation. They remembered the transformation in their own confidence once the 76mm gun gave them a fighting chance against Panthers. As one veteran wrote to Darnell in 1975, "Before your modification, we feared every hedgerow might hide a panther we couldn't fight. After, we still respected the panther, but no longer saw it as our death sentence." As the decades passed, Joseph Darnell continued his quiet life in Coopersville. His repair shop evolved into a successful auto parts business run by his oldest son, while Darnell himself gradually retired to spend more time with his grandchildren. The war became an increasingly distant memory, though he maintained correspondence with surviving members of the 4th Armored Division. In 1984, 40 years after his unauthorized modification changed the course of armored warfare in Europe, Darnell received an invitation to the dedication of a new tank training facility at Fort Knox. To his surprise, the facility was to be named the Darnell Technical Innovation Center, a formal acknowledgement of his contribution that would have been unimaginable during the war itself. At the dedication ceremony, now retired General James Patterson, who had been a young lieutenant in the 4th Armored during the summer of 1944, addressed the gathering. American military doctrine has always officially emphasized standardization and uniformity. But our true strength has often come from men like Joseph Darnell, who recognized when the doctrine needed to evolve to meet battlefield realities. Patterson turned to the white-haired Darnell, seated among the honored guests. Joseph didn't just modify a tank. He challenged a mindset. He showed that sometimes the man in the field sees what the planners at headquarters cannot, and that true leadership means having the courage to act on that insight, even when it means breaking the rules. For the tank crews who served in Normandy and across Europe, the introduction of the 76mm gun in the Sherman represented more than a technical improvement. It was a psychological turning point. Before the modification, encountering a panther meant near certain death, unless they could retreat or call for air support. After, it meant they had a fighting chance. This transformation in battlefield psychology ultimately proved as important as the technical advantage itself. Tank crews who believe they can win fight differently than those who believe they are doomed. The confidence instilled by the 76mm Sherman allowed American tankers to engage more aggressively and effectively, changing the entire dynamic of armored warfare on the Western Front. By 1990, as historians gained access to both American and German wartime records through declassification, the full impact of Darnell's modification became clearer. Statistical analysis revealed that after the widespread deployment of 76mm Shermans, the loss ratio against Panthers improved from approximately 5-1 against the Americans to nearly 2-1, still favoring the German tanks technically, but no longer an insurmountable advantage given American numerical superiority. More tellingly, German battle reports from late 1944 showed a significant shift in Panther tactics. Where they had previously operated with confidence against American armor, they now approached Sherman concentrations with far greater caution, often overestimating the number of 76mm equipped tanks they faced. A captured German intelligence assessment from January 1945 noted, "American tank crews now display an aggressive confidence previously absent. They will deliberately seek engagement rather than withdraw when encountering our Panthers." This suggests a fundamental change in either their equipment capability or tactical doctrine. It was, of course, both, a technical modification that enabled a tactical transformation, all stemming from one sergeant's willingness to defy conventional wisdom. Joseph Darnell passed away peacefully in his sleep on March 12, 1993, at the age of 71. His obituary in the Coopersville Gazette mentioned his service in World War II and his Silver Star, but said nothing of his pivotal role in modifying the Sherman tank. Like many of the greatest contributors to victory, his most significant achievement remained largely unknown to his community. His funeral, however, told a different story. Among the mourners were more than 40 former Sherman crewmen who traveled from across the country to pay their respects, many wearing their old unit patches and campaign ribbons. They came not just to honor a fellow veteran, but to acknowledge a man whose technical disobedience had given them a chance to survive when official doctrine had offered them little hope. Former Corporal Ray Hawkins, Darnell's loader from Detroit Iron, spoke briefly at the service. Joe never talked much about what he did. He'd just say we did what needed doing. But those of us who rolled into combat in those tanks know the truth. His willingness to break the rules when the rules were wrong saved more American lives than any medal citation could ever capture. In the years following Darnell's death, military historians began to take greater interest in his story as part of a broader re-evaluation of bottom-up innovation during World War II. The tension between standardization and battlefield adaptation, between following orders and improvising when necessary, became recognized as a crucial dynamic in American military effectiveness. A 2004 analysis by the Army War College titled Adaptive Leadership in Mechanized Warfare cited the Darnell modification as one of the most consequential examples of field-initiated technical innovation in American military history. The study noted that Darnell's action represented a perfect case study in balancing discipline with initiative, breaking specific rules while serving the larger mission objective of defeating the enemy and preserving American lives. By the early 21st century, with American forces engaged in asymmetric warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, the lessons of Darnell's innovation found new relevance. As soldiers faced improvised explosive devices and other threats not anticipated in pre-war planning, the military establishment proved more receptive to field modifications and adaptations than it had been in 1944. Programs like the Rapid Equipping Force, REF, and the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization, JIEDO, explicitly incorporated frontline feedback and rapid prototyping in ways that would have seemed radical during World War II. The institutional resistance that initially met Darnell's modifications had evolved into a more balanced approach that recognized the value of battlefield innovation while maintaining necessary standards. In 2015, during a renovation of the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, the curators discovered something remarkable in the archives. George Patton's personal diary entries from July 1944, including his thoughts after learning of the unauthorized Sherman modifications. Patton, himself no stranger to controversy and breaking convention, had written, "Met with Colonel Peterson regarding a sergeant who modified his Sherman to take on Panthers, technically a court-martial offense, but the man destroyed 2 Panthers that were about to break through our lines. This is exactly the kind of American ingenuity that will win this war. Better to ask forgiveness than permission when the alternative is defeat. I've instructed that these modifications be implemented across the Third Army without delay. We'll sort out the paperwork after we've killed more Germans." This entry confirmed what many had long suspected, that Darnell's avoidance of punishment had not been mere luck, but the result of senior commanders recognizing the value of his innovation despite its unauthorized nature. It revealed the pragmatic flexibility that often operated beneath the surface of the seemingly rigid military hierarchy. In 2018, 74 years after Joseph Darnell first modified his Sherman in the hedgerows of Normandy, the Army Tank Museum unveiled a special exhibit titled Innovation Under Fire: The Evolution of the Sherman Tank. In centerpiece of the exhibit was a restored M4A176W Sherman, painted in the markings of Detroit Iron, and accompanied by a detailed account of how one tank crew's unauthorized modification helped change the course of armored warfare in Europe. At the exhibit's opening ceremony, Lieutenant General Michael Harrison, commanding general of the Armor Center, reflected on the lasting significance of Darnell's actions. Military organizations necessarily operate through standardization, procedure, and chain of command. These structures provide the framework for effective operations. But war is ultimately a human endeavor that often requires adaptation beyond established doctrine. Harrison paused, looking at the Sherman gleaming under the museum lights. The genius of the American military at its best has been finding the balance, knowing when to follow procedure, and knowing when the situation demands breaking those procedures in service of the mission. Joseph Darnell's story reminds us that sometimes true loyalty to the mission means challenging how we execute it. For the few surviving Sherman crewmen who had faced Panthers in combat, the exhibit represented long overdue recognition of a truth they had known since 1944. That sometimes salvation comes not from following the rulebook, but from having the courage to rewrite it when circumstances demand. One visitor to the exhibit, 94-year-old former Sherman driver William Carpenter, summed it up simply to his great-grandson as they stood before the tank. "Before they fixed these tanks like Darnell showed them, meeting a Panther meant you were probably going to die. After, it meant you had a fighting chance. Sometimes, son, that's all the difference in the world, just having a fighting chance." The mathematics of warfare are often cold and unforgiving. The Sherman's inferiority to the Panther in armor, firepower, and optics created a calculated disparity that doctrine attempted to address through numerical superiority and combined arms tactics. But Joseph Darnell understood something that the specifications and tactical manuals missed: that the human element could sometimes overcome mechanical disadvantages through innovation and adaptation. His willingness to challenge the established parameters transformed what had been a mathematical certainty of defeat into a possibility of victory. In doing so, he demonstrated a truth that military organizations have often struggled to reconcile: that while discipline and standardization provide the foundation for effective operations, flexibility and adaptation provide the edge that often determines survival. In the hedgerows of Normandy during that fateful summer of 1944, one sergeant's decision to disobey direct orders and modify his tank against regulations didn't just save his own crew. It cascaded into a transformation that saved countless American lives and helped hasten the Allied victory in Europe. The story of Joseph Darnell and his modified Sherman offers a powerful lesson that continues to resonate in military thinking today: that sometimes the most profound loyalty to the mission comes not from rigid adherence to procedure, but from the courage to innovate when those procedures fail to address the realities of the battlefield. As modern militaries face ever-evolving threats in increasingly complex operational environments, the tension between standardization and adaptation remains as relevant as it was in the hedgerows of Normandy. The challenge for military organizations is to foster the discipline necessary for coordinated operations, while creating space for the innovation needed to overcome unexpected challenges. Joseph Darnell's legacy lives on not just in the technical specifications of the Sherman tanks that eventually incorporated his modifications, but in the ongoing dialogue about how military organizations balance procedure with pragmatism, doctrine with innovation, and orders with initiative. For the men who faced Panthers across the battlefields of Europe, the equation was simpler. Before Darnell's modification, the Sherman was a potential coffin. After, it was a fighting vehicle with a chance of victory. That transformation, from certain defeat to possible victory, represents the most profound impact that any innovation can achieve in warfare. What would you have done in Joseph Darnell's position? Followed orders and waited for the tank destroyers that might never arrive in time, or broken the rules to give your men a fighting chance against a superior enemy? The courage to make that choice and accept the consequences is what separated Darnell from many of his peers. His story reminds us that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against the enemy, but against our own institutional resistance to change and innovation. By choosing to act rather than wait, to modify rather than accept, Darnell embodied the best of American pragmatism and ingenuity under pressure. Share this story so others remember what real courage means: not just the physical bravery to face enemy fire, but the moral courage to challenge established wisdom when lives hang in the balance.